My name's Henry Callahan, and this story happened to me on a night I'll never forget. October 19th, 1997. I was hauling medical supplies from Albuquerque to Houston, driving through the endless, dark stretch of Route 66. It was just me and my old Kenworth, loaded down with boxes of ventilators and syringes. It felt like a regular night, quiet, calm, the kind of solitude I'd grown to love about the open road. But something about that night was off. You ever get that gut feeling like something's not right but you can't put your finger on it? That was me as soon as I left the last truck stop. The radio chatter was strange too. Truckers kept talking about people going missing around a place they called the Road of Despair. I laughed it off, figuring it was just another urban legend to keep us entertained on long hauls. Turns out, I should have listened. Around midnight, I noticed my eyes getting heavy. You can't fight sleep when you're on the road, so I decided to pull off at a rest area. It looked abandoned, just a couple of flickering streetlights and an old, dusty truck parked near the edge of the lot. The thing looked like it hadn't moved in years. I parked my rig, grabbed my thermos of coffee, and stepped out into the crisp night air. There wasn't a soul around, only the distant howls of coyotes and the hum of insects. I leaned against my truck, sipping my coffee and staring at the stars. They hung low, almost close enough to touch. That's one thing I'll always love about driving at night, the quiet beauty of it all. But as I stood there, the feeling in my gut came back, stronger this time. I brushed it off, thinking I just needed to stretch my legs. I wandered over to the other truck out of curiosity. Its windshield was coated in dust, and the tires were practically flat. But what caught my eye was a faint red smear on the driver's door. I froze. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was rust, or maybe someone spilled something, but deep down I knew better. I should have walked away right then, but curiosity got the better of me. I peeked through the window and saw a mess of blankets and old food wrappers. Nothing too unusual for a long hauler. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A handprint on the inside of the glass, smeared like someone had been banging on it. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but instead I walked around to the back of the truck. The trailer door was slightly ajar. I pulled it open just enough to take a look inside, and what I saw still haunts me. Piles of old clothes, beer cans, and something that looked like bones. Small ones. Human, maybe. I slammed the door shut and backed away, my heart pounding like a jackhammer. As I turned to head back to my rig, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic scraping sound. Metal on metal. It was coming from the rest area's bathroom building. My breath caught in my throat. I told myself to get in my truck and drive, but my feet wouldn't move. Instead, I found myself walking toward the sound. The bathroom was dimly lit, one flickering bulb casting long, eerie shadows. I peered through the cracked window and saw him. A man, tall and thin, with a wild look in his eyes and greasy, unkempt hair. He was hunched over a sink, sharpening a massive hunting knife on a whetstone. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed in the small space, and every stroke seemed deliberate, precise. I stepped back, trying to make as little noise as possible, but my boot scraped against the gravel. The man's head snapped up, and for a split second our eyes met. There was something in his gaze that made my skin crawl, a mix of rage and hunger. I bolted. I ran back to my truck, my legs barely keeping up with the adrenaline pumping through me. Behind me, I heard the bathroom door slam open and the man's voice yelling something I couldn't make out. I didn't dare look back. I climbed into my rig, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get the key into the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life and I floored it out of there. As I sped down the highway, my heart still racing, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man was standing in the middle of the road, his knife catching the faint glow of my taillights. I didn't stop driving until I reached a truck stop with plenty of lights and people. That night I called the local sheriff's office and told them everything. They promised to check it out, but the officer on the phone sounded skeptical. I couldn't blame him. Who'd believe a story like that? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something much worse than a mugging or a fight. When the cops showed up at the truck stop the next morning, I knew it wasn't good news. They asked me to sit down, their faces grim. "We found the truck you mentioned," one of them said, "and the bathroom." There were signs of a struggle, blood, broken glass, the works. But no man, no knife, just nothing. I don't know who or what I ran into that night, but it changed me. Every time I'm out on the road, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, listening for that scraping sound. And sometimes late at night, I swear I hear it again. The weeks after that night were rough. I tried to forget about it, but I couldn't. Every time I got back on the road, I felt that gnawing sense of unease, like I wasn't alone, like something was watching me. I kept my doors locked at every stop, and my tire iron was never far from reach. One night, a few months later, I was driving through a remote stretch near a small town called Arroyo Ridge. It was just past midnight, the kind of dead silence that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. I stopped at another rest area, this one a little bigger, with a vending machine and a couple of parked rigs. I figured I'd stretch my legs, grab a soda, and keep moving. The place seemed fine at first. Quiet, clean enough, nothing out of the ordinary. But as I walked back to my truck, I heard it again. That same scraping sound, metal on metal, slow and deliberate. My stomach dropped. I scanned the area, my eyes darting between the parked trucks and the shadows they cast. Then I saw it. A figure, crouched by the back wheels of the truck next to mine, working on something with what looked like a knife. I froze. My mind raced, trying to figure out if I should confront him or get the hell out of there. Before I could decide, the man turned his head and our eyes met. It wasn't the same guy from before. This one was older, with a gray beard and a weathered face. But there was something familiar in the way he moved, the way he looked at me, like he knew me. I grabbed my tire iron and stepped closer, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey, what are you doing?" The man jumped up, startled, and dropped something metallic. "Just fixing a flat," he muttered, holding up a piece of rubber hose. I lowered the tire iron, feeling a mix of relief and stupidity. "Sorry," I said, backing off. "Thought you were someone else." He grumbled something under his breath and went back to work. I climbed into my truck, locked the doors, and sat there for a while trying to calm down. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Something about the man, the way he moved, the way he looked at me, felt wrong. I couldn't shake the thought that I'd seen him somewhere before. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man with the knife, standing in the middle of the road, watching me drive away. And every time I opened them, I half expected to see him standing outside my truck waiting. A few weeks later, I found myself on another late-night haul. This time, I was headed up to Denver, a route I'd driven countless times before. I tried to convince myself that the eerie nights were behind me, but deep down, I knew better. There's a kind of paranoia that clings to you after something like that, and it doesn't let go easily. It was around 2 a.m. when I decided to stop at a truck plaza just off the highway. This place was bigger than most, a diner, fuel pumps, even a small motel attached. It felt safer. I pulled into a well-lit spot near the entrance, climbed down from the cab, and headed into the diner for a cup of coffee. The place was nearly empty except for a waitress and a couple of truckers nursing their meals. I ordered my coffee and sat near the window, keeping my rig in view. The warm light of the diner was comforting, almost enough to make me forget the creeping unease that always seemed to follow me. Almost. As I stirred cream into my coffee, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure, tall and thin, wearing a dark hoodie, was standing near my truck. My heart dropped into my stomach. It wasn't the older man from before. This one moved differently, more deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. I stood up, knocking over my chair, and the waitress looked at me like I'd lost my mind. I didn't care. I bolted for the door, the cool night air hitting me like a slap to the face. By the time I got to my truck, the figure was gone, but something was wrong. The cab door was slightly ajar. My hands shook as I climbed inside, checking every inch of the cab and sleeper. Nothing. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing. A small object on the driver's seat. A knife. Not just any knife, but the same hunting knife I'd seen that night at the rest stop. Its blade gleamed under the plaza's fluorescent lights, and there was a note taped to the handle. It read, "See you soon." I don't remember much after that. I must have driven non-stop until I reached Denver, because the next thing I knew it was morning, and I was parked outside the warehouse where I was supposed to deliver. My hands were still trembling as I handed off the paperwork and climbed back into the cab. The knife and note were gone. To this day, I don't know if I imagined it all or if someone or something was really out there, playing games with me. But every time I hear the scrape of metal against metal, I remember that night. And I wonder if one day, "See you soon," will come true. I've been a truck driver for over 15 years, and let me tell you, I've seen some weird stuff. But nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to what happened back in 2017. It still gives me chills just thinking about it. I was hauling a load of electronics across the Mojave Desert, heading to some small town in Texas. It was late at night, pitch black, and I was already regretting my decision to take this route. My truck's headlights weren't the best, and I'd been putting off fixing them for a while. Usually it's not a big deal, but out there where there's no light anywhere, it was painfully obvious. The road stretched endlessly in front of me, and I had to squint just to make sure I wasn't drifting. I'd been driving for hours, counting down the minutes until sunrise, but I couldn't afford to stop. I needed the cash. So I kept going, convincing myself it'd all be fine. After all, it was a straight shot through the desert. What could go wrong? About an hour before dawn, something caught my eye. Up ahead in the middle of the road, I saw a car with its hazard lights on. I hit the brakes hard, my truck groaning to a stop just a few feet from it. The car was sitting smack dab on the yellow line with the passenger door wide open. Weird, right? I thought maybe someone needed help or had broken down. Curiosity got the better of me, and I backed up my truck a bit before stepping out. The desert night was eerily quiet, not even a breeze. All I could hear was the faint clicking of the car's hazard lights. I've never felt so alone and exposed in my life. The car was a shiny red sedan, looked brand new, but something about it felt off. I called out, "Hello? Anybody there?" Nothing, just silence. I approached the car cautiously. The passenger door was wide open, and when I peered inside, the first thing I noticed was that the keys were still in the ignition. The engine wasn't running, though. I glanced around, half expecting someone to pop up from behind the car or maybe out of the bushes, but there was no one. "All right," I muttered to myself. "This is weird." I checked the back seat. Empty. Not even a bag or a jacket left behind. At this point, my gut was screaming at me to just get back in my truck and keep driving. But something about the whole situation felt unfinished. I had to figure out what was going on. That's when I decided to check the trunk. Maybe someone was stashing supplies, or hell, I don't know what I was thinking. The trunk was locked, so I went back to the front and grabbed the keys. I could feel my heart thumping in my chest as I unlocked it. But even with the keys, the trunk wouldn't budge. It felt like it was jammed from the inside. "What the hell?" I whispered. I'm not one to give up easy, so I opened the back door and crawled through the seats to see if I could push the trunk open from inside. That's when I saw them. 3 black garbage bags stuffed into the trunk, tied up tight with heavy-duty rope. And there was something else. A shovel. It was small, like one you'd use in a garden, but the blade was dirty, like it had been used to dig recently. My stomach dropped. Something was very, very wrong here. I didn't even realize I was holding my breath until I heard a loud noise in the distance, like a gunshot. My head snapped up, and I froze. For a second, I thought maybe I'd imagined it. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a voice calling out. It was faint, but it was there. "Hey! Hey, you!" My blood turned cold. Someone was out there, and they were coming my way. I didn't stick around to see who it was. The voice was getting louder, and the panic in my chest was screaming at me to move. I scrambled out of the car, nearly tripping over my own feet, and bolted back to my truck. My hands were shaking as I climbed in and slammed the door shut. I turned the key in the ignition, but the engine didn't start. Come on, I muttered, smacking the dashboard like it would help. The voice was even closer now, and I finally spotted a figure in the distance sprinting toward me. It was a man, stocky build, wearing a dirty jacket and boots. He had something in his hand, but I couldn't make out what it was in the dark. He was yelling something, but I couldn't focus on the words. My brain was too busy screaming, "Get out of here!" The engine roared to life just as the man got within a few yards of the truck. I threw it into gear and hit the gas. The truck lurched forward, and I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was still running, but there was no way he could keep up. Or so I thought. A few minutes later, I saw headlights behind me. My stomach sank. The guy must have had a car parked nearby because now he was following me. And fast. The red sedan's headlights got closer and closer, and my hands gripped the wheel so tight they hurt. He started honking over and over like a madman. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but I didn't stop. No way was I going to pull over for this lunatic. Then he pulled up alongside me, swerving dangerously close to my truck. I could see him now, his face illuminated by the glow of his dashboard. He wasn't yelling anymore. He was staring straight at me, his expression cold and unreadable. The shovel was on the passenger seat next to him, and it looked like there was something dark smeared on the blade. I slammed on the horn, hoping it'd scare him off, but he didn't budge. Instead, he swerved his car directly in front of me and hit the brakes. I barely had time to react, jerking the wheel to avoid slamming into him. My truck skidded, and for a moment I thought I was going to flip. Somehow I managed to regain control and keep going. But he wasn't done yet. He sped up again, his car tailgating me so close I thought he was going to ram me. That's when I saw the flashing lights in the distance, red and blue, cutting through the darkness like a lifeline. The police. The guy must have seen them too, because he swerved off the road and disappeared into the desert. I kept driving until I reached the lights, my entire body trembling. When I finally stopped, I practically fell out of the truck, gasping for air. The officer approached, and I blurted out everything that had happened. But instead of chasing the guy, he just nodded and started taking my statement. I couldn't believe it. That lunatic was out there, and they weren't even going after him. I couldn't believe how calm the cop was. I mean, I'd just been chased down by a maniac with a shovel and a gun. But all he did was jot down notes like I'd reported a stolen bike or something. "We'll file the report and notify the authorities in the area," he said, as if that would magically fix everything. I wanted to scream at him, but what good would that do? I was alive. That was the important thing. Before leaving, I asked if they could at least check out the red sedan. The cop nodded and said they'd send someone. But honestly, I doubted they would. The guy had vanished into the desert, and I doubted he'd leave his car behind. I climbed back into my truck, still shaking, and started the engine. Every sound made me jump. A rattling soda can in the cup holder, the groan of the seat as I shifted my weight. Even my own breathing felt too loud. I just wanted to put as much distance between me and that stretch of road as possible. About 30 minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was a text. No name, just a number I didn't recognize. The message read, "You shouldn't have opened the trunk, you'll regret it." I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I stared at the message, my hands trembling as I gripped the phone. How did they get my number? Was it the guy from the desert? The road was dead silent around me. No other cars, no signs of life. Just the endless expanse of the Mojave, stretching into darkness. I locked the doors and started driving again, faster this time, constantly checking my mirrors. Every pair of headlights in the distance made my skin crawl. I tried calling the number back, but it went straight to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. What would I even say? Instead, I kept driving, praying that whoever it was would just leave me alone. Then, about an hour later, I saw something in the distance. A figure standing in the middle of the road. My stomach turned to ice. It was the man. Same dirty jacket, same boots. He was just standing there holding that damn shovel. I swerved around him, barely missing him, and floored the gas. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw him again, standing in the road behind me, even though there was no way he could have moved that fast. It didn't make sense. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Whatever was happening, it wasn't normal. My gut told me this was way bigger than some random psycho in the desert. I had to get out of there. The road felt endless, and the darkness seemed to close in around me. My phone buzzed again. Another text. "You can't outrun this." My hands were slick with sweat, slipping on the steering wheel as I tried to push the truck faster. Then I saw it. A gas station. Its fluorescent lights flickering in the distance. It felt like a beacon, a safe haven in the middle of this nightmare. I pulled in, my tires screeching as I came to a stop. The place looked abandoned, but I didn't care. I jumped out of the truck and ran inside, slamming the door behind me. The clerk, a young guy with earbuds in, looked up at me like I was crazy. "Call the cops," I gasped. "Now." Before he could respond, the lights flickered, and I heard the sound of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I turned to the glass doors and saw him. The man from the desert, standing just outside, his face shadowed but unmistakable. He raised the shovel, tapping it against the glass. The clerk grabbed the phone and dialed, but the man didn't try to break in. He just stood there, tapping, staring, and then, just as the police answered, he turned and walked away into the darkness. The cops arrived 15 minutes later, but by then the man was long gone. They searched the area but found nothing. No footprints, no car, no sign he'd ever been there. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but every time I drive through the desert, I can't help but check my mirrors, half expecting to see him standing there waiting. Hey folks, let me tell you about the night I wish I could forget. I was 38, driving my old Kenworth W900 down a lonely back road in Arkansas, hauling coal to Little Rock. It was one of those sticky hot nights where the air feels like a wet blanket, the kind that makes you want to roll down the windows and hope for a breeze, but let me tell you, no breeze was coming. I was about 3 hours in, cruising at a steady pace, when I saw it. A car on the side of the road, hazards blinking. It was one of those beat-up sedans, the kind you know has been through hell, and there was a guy standing next to it, waving his arms like he'd just seen the only other human in miles. Normally, I wouldn't stop. Too many stories about truckers getting robbed or worse. But something about the look on this guy's face got to me. He wasn't just desperate, he was scared. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over a little ahead of him. He ran up to the truck before I even got out. "Hey man, thanks for stopping. My car overheated and I'm kind of in a bind." He introduced himself as Jared, and his story was simple. Too simple. "I'm heading to Little Rock, same as you," he said, but his eyes kept darting to the dark woods lining the road like he was expecting something to jump out. I should have left right there, but I didn't. Instead, I grabbed some water from my truck and helped him pour it into his radiator. The whole time, Jared wouldn't stop fidgeting like the woods were crawling with ghosts. And when his car refused to start, he asked for a ride. Against all logic, I said yes. He climbed into the passenger seat, and we were back on the road. The guy barely spoke, just stared out the window with this haunted look. I didn't push for conversation. I was already regretting my decision. About 20 minutes in, I couldn't take the silence anymore. "You okay, man? You've been twitchier than a squirrel." Jared hesitated, then let out a shaky laugh. "Yeah, it's complicated. Let's just say I've got some people after me." "People?" I asked. "Like, bad people?" He nodded, running a hand through his messy hair. "Yeah, they're, part of this group. A cult, actually. I kind of borrowed something from them." Borrowed? Who even says that? I'd heard enough crazy stories on the road to know when someone's full of it, but Jared's voice had this edge of panic that was hard to fake. He looked over at me. "You're not gonna turn me in, right?" I snorted. "Turn you in? To who? The cult hotline?" But his words were sinking in. I didn't want to get mixed up in someone else's mess, but there I was, driving with a guy who'd pissed off some lunatics. We drove on in silence for a while. Eventually, the glow of a diner's neon sign broke through the dark. "You hungry?" I asked. Jared nodded like he hadn't eaten in days. The diner was almost empty, just a couple of locals nursing coffee at the counter. We sat in a booth at the back, ordered burgers and fries. Jared finally started to relax, even cracked a smile when the waitress brought our drinks. For a second, I thought maybe the worst was behind us. I couldn't have been more wrong. The bell above the door jingled and two men walked in. Big guys, mean faces. And Jared's reaction told me everything I needed to know. His face went pale, and he leaned across the table. "It's them," he whispered. "We gotta go." Too late. They'd already spotted us. The two men didn't waste time. They walked straight to our booth, their boots clunking against the tile floor like a countdown. Jared shrank in his seat, and I could feel the tension rolling off him in waves. "Evening, boys," I said, trying to sound casual. "Something we can help you with?" The bigger guy, bald with a scar running down his cheek, leaned over the table. "Yeah, you can hand him over." He jerked his thumb toward Jared. "He's got something that belongs to us." "Look," I said, raising my hands. "Maybe we can talk this out. No need to make a scene." The scarred man sneered. "This ain't a negotiation, trucker. Step aside." Before I could say anything, Jared bolted from the booth, heading for the back exit. The men cursed and chased after him. I hesitated for a split second before following. I didn't know what I was doing, but I couldn't just sit there. Outside, the parking lot was dimly lit by a flickering streetlight. Jared was fast, but the men were faster. They caught up to him near the edge of the lot. One of them grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against a car. "Hey!" I shouted, running toward them. "Let him go." The scarred man turned to me, pulling a knife from his belt. "You should have stayed out of this." But I didn't. I lunged at him, tackling him to the ground. The knife skittered across the pavement. The other guy turned on me, his fists flying. I felt a punch land on my ribs, knocking the wind out of me, but I didn't stop. I swung back, my fist connecting with his jaw. Jared, meanwhile, scrambled to his feet and ran. "Get to the truck!" I yelled, still grappling with the scarred man. Jared didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted toward my truck, disappearing into the cab. The two men were focused on me now, and I knew I was outmatched. The scarred man landed a blow that sent me stumbling, but I managed to stay on my feet. "You don't know what you're messing with," he growled, his face twisted with rage. "Neither do you," I shot back, throwing another punch. It wasn't enough. The second guy grabbed me from behind, pinning my arms. The scarred man reached for his knife again, and I braced myself for the worst. Then, out of nowhere, the sound of an engine roared to life. My truck's headlights blazed on, and the horn blared. Jared was behind the wheel. The men froze, momentarily blinded by the lights. Taking advantage of their distraction, I broke free and ran toward the truck. Jared swung the door open for me, and I jumped in. "Go!" I shouted. He slammed on the gas, and the truck lurched forward, leaving the men in the dust. I looked back to see them scrambling to their car, but we were already too far ahead. My heart was pounding as we tore down the road. Jared was shaking, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "I didn't mean for you to get dragged into this." I didn't answer. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. One thing was clear. We weren't safe yet. The further we drove, the darker it got. Jared didn't say much, just kept his eyes on the road like the devil himself was tailing us. After about an hour, I started to notice something strange. The trees lining the road were getting denser, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers in the moonlight. The air felt heavier, like we were driving into a different world. "Where are we going?" I asked. Jared hesitated. "There's a place up ahead, somewhere we can hide." That didn't sit right with me. "Hide? From who?" He glanced at me, his face pale. "It's not just them. The cult. They've got people everywhere, and if they find us, it's over." I gripped the dashboard, trying to keep calm. but the way he said it made my skin crawl. We turned onto a dirt path that led into the woods. The truck barely fit, its headlights cutting through the thick darkness. Finally, we stopped in a small clearing. Jared grabbed a worn backpack from under his seat and motioned for me to follow. "Come on," he said. "We can't stay out in the open." Reluctantly, I followed him into the woods, every step crunching against fallen leaves. The air was cold now, unnaturally so. It was like the forest was alive, watching us. Jared led us to an old cabin, barely standing, its windows shattered and door hanging off its hinges. "This is your plan?" I asked, incredulous. He nodded. "It's not much, but it'll do." We barely had time to catch our breath before the sound of engines echoed through the trees. Jared's face went white. "They found us." "How?" I asked, but he didn't answer. Instead, he shoved the backpack into my hands. "If anything happens, get this out of here. Don't let them have it." Before I could argue, headlights broke through the darkness. The cult members were here. They didn't waste time, spilling out of their cars with flashlights and weapons. Jared pulled out a rusted shotgun from a corner of the cabin and handed me a heavy wrench. "You sure about this?" I asked. He nodded. "We don't have a choice." The next few minutes were chaos. The cult members swarmed the cabin, their voices shouting commands and threats. Jared fired the shotgun, scattering them momentarily. I swung the wrench at anyone who got too close, the weight of it vibrating through my arms with each hit. But there were too many of them. They broke through the cabin door and all hell broke loose. Jared fought like a man possessed, but it wasn't enough. One of them tackled him to the ground, wrenching the shotgun from his hands. I tried to help, but someone grabbed me from behind, slamming me against the wall. I dropped the wrench, my vision blurring. Through the haze, I saw Jared reach into his backpack and pull out a small, glowing object. It looked like a talisman, pulsing with an eerie light. The cult members froze, their eyes wide with fear. "You want it?" Jared shouted. "Take it." He threw the talisman into the fire burning in the cabin's corner. The light exploded, blinding everyone. I felt a wave of heat and force knock me off my feet. When I came to, the cabin was in ruins, and the cult members were gone. Jared lay on the ground, motionless. I crawled to him, shaking his shoulder. "Jared, wake up." His eyes fluttered open, a weak smile on his face. "We did it," he whispered. Then he was gone. I don't know how I made it out of those woods, but I did, carrying Jared's backpack and the weight of everything that happened. I kept driving, haunted by the memories of that night. And I still wonder, what was in that talisman? And what did we unleash? It was supposed to be a smooth run, just me, my rig, and the open road. But the rain had other plans. The kind of rain that pounds so hard on your windshield you start questioning if your wipers are doing anything at all. Fuel gauge was dipping low, and when I saw that old faded sign for a rest stop, I thought, this'll have to do. When I pulled in, it was like something out of a horror movie. The lights were dim, what few there were, and the whole place had this vibe like it had been forgotten by the world. There were 2 rusted-out cars sitting there, probably abandoned for years. A busted-up wooden cabin stood next to the bathrooms, which looked just as bad. Potholes everywhere, graffiti on the walls. One of the tags said, "Don't stay after midnight." Funny thing to read when it's already past 11. I hopped out, figuring I'd use the restroom and crash in my cab for a few hours. As I headed back, though, I spotted this guy near the picnic tables by the cabin. He had a hood up, just standing there, not moving. I waved, trying to keep it casual, but he didn't even flinch. My stomach did that little twist, the one that tells you something ain't right. Back in my truck, I locked the doors. Habit, but that night it felt more like survival. I tried to shake it off. Just some weirdo, I told myself. But the rain wasn't the only sound anymore. Footsteps, light at first, circling the truck. I sat up, peering into the side mirrors, but the rain smeared everything into a blur. Then came the tapping, not on one window, both sides, back and forth. My heart started pounding, but I told myself, stay calm. I grabbed my phone. No signal, of course. That's how these things always go, right? I slammed my hand on the horn, hoping to scare off whoever, or whatever, was out there. It worked for a second. Silence. But then the horn just seemed to rile them up. The tapping turned into banging, harder, louder, like they were testing the strength of the glass. I don't know what came over me, but I thought maybe I could scare them off. I hit the headlights, flooding the parking lot with light. That's when I saw them. 3 figures, all wearing those long, dark hooded cloaks, just standing there staring at my truck. I swear one of them had something shiny in their hand, like a chain or a blade. Before I could react, the truck's engine sputtered and died. My heart sank. This wasn't just some random prank. These people, whatever they were, wanted me stuck. I glanced toward the cabin. There was this faint light coming from inside, flickering like an old candle. Maybe someone else was here. Someone who could help. Grabbing my flashlight, I made a break for it. Rain was coming down hard, soaking me to the bone in seconds. The moment I stepped inside the cabin, it felt like I'd walked into another world. The walls were covered in these weird symbols, scratched in like someone had been desperate to leave a message. Burned out candles were scattered everywhere. And then there was this old radio, one of those ancient kinds with knobs, sitting on a table. At first it was just static, but then it started picking up this low, garbled voice. I couldn't make out the words until it said clear as day, "Leave now, don't look back." I whipped around to look out the window. The hooded figures were closer now, forming a circle around my truck. My flashlight flickered, of course, because nothing can go right in a situation like this. I had to get out of there. The run back to my truck was a blur. The rain, the mud, my boots slipping. It all felt like a nightmare. One of them tried to grab me. I swung the flashlight as hard as I could, catching them in the arm. I didn't stop to see if it hurt them. I just kept running. When I reached the truck, I yanked the door open and threw myself inside. The keys were still in the ignition. I turned them, praying it would start. For a second, it felt like the battery was dead. But then, miraculously, the engine roared to life. The hooded figures froze, their faces hidden in shadow. I floored it, not even bothering to look back until I hit the main road. In my rearview mirror, I could see them still standing there, their silhouettes growing smaller as I sped off into the night. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles down the highway. The clerk gave me a weird look when I stumbled in, drenched and shaking. I didn't bother explaining. What could I even say? The next morning, I went out to check the truck. That's when I saw it. Handprints. Dozens of them, smeared in something dark and dried, covering the back of my rig. I don't know what those people wanted, and I'm not sure I want to know. But I can tell you this. I'll never stop at one of those rest areas again.